Chapter 34. David Hunter Duncan meets Joe Fungo. Jim Garfield sat in the Diamond Valley food court and arranged the table screen into a 16-channel, one-viewer format. 5 of the channels were set to fighting and martial arts. 5 were set to channels that covered auto racing and high performance mechanics. 5 channels were set to news, the Warfare channel receiving the only audio feed. On the 16th channel, Jim Garfield read his email. Jim Garfield was not the least bit comfortable staging a meeting at a mall food court with hundreds of security cams that stored images in perpetuity. But Joe Fungo would only agree to be introduced to David Hunter Duncan in an open area, and Diamond Valley Food Court was one such place. Jim Garfield knew that Joe Fungo feared him ever since the Waller County chlorine gas attack, and Fungo would only meet with him in public areas. He was correct in suspecting that Jim Garfield wanted to exterminate him. From his window seat, Jim Garfield was able to spot the pronounced limp of David Hunter Duncan hobbling across the parking lot. Oh, shit. He brought Ray along, the tall guy in the limp, caught and stored forever by a gazillion security cams. David Hunter Duncan might be on the brink of senility, but Ray should know better. Jim Garfield had asked Ray to keep an eye on their lesser alert friend for signs of fading attention. Is senility contagious? Scanning the food court, Jim Garfield spied Joe Fungo ordering waffle skewers and a freshly minted Houston Astros baseball cap. Black shoes, black socks, black shirt, and black pants topped off with a never-before-worn orangish baseball cap and tinted prop glasses that screamed suspicion. But at least Joe Fungo did honor the protocol by seating himself as far away from Jim Garfield as possible and refraining from looking in his direction. As David Hunter Duncan and Ray approached the suite of glass doors just 50 feet away, Jim Garfield frantically typed a text message on the table screen. Ignore me. Baseball cap. He hoped David Hunter Duncan was carrying his cell. Ray walked past Jim Garfield without looking at him and proceeded deep into the bowels of the mall. David Hunter Duncan froze 10 feet from Jim Garfield as his cell chirped its Guitar Town ringtone. He studied his cell screen for what seemed like an hour to Jim Garfield. He then looked directly at Jim Garfield with a dog staring into a megaphone expression and asked, "What's this mean?" in a loud tone that bordered on shouting. Jim Garfield winced and cringed and motioned his incautious friend to his table. With dropped jaw and furrowed brow, David Hunter Duncan limped over to see his friend. As inaudibly as possible, Jim Garfield whispered, "He's over there, in the baseball cap." "Huh?" David Hunter Duncan bleated in volume sufficient to turn heads at neighboring tables and passers-by. Jim Garfield tried to compose himself. He was introducing the architect of America's first chlorine gas attack to the first copycat of that historical event. It was bigger history than Che meeting Fidel. Unfortunately, this Fidel was too frequently confused by simple instructions and could probably use a hearing aid. Resigning to the fact that security had been hopelessly contaminated, Jim Garfield stood and moved close enough to whisper in David Hunter Duncan's ear, "Please do not talk so loud." Jim Garfield sat back down. He could see the anger brew in his friend's face, and he watched it fade as suddenly as it had appeared. Jim Garfield signaled for his partner, who was standing perpendicular to him, to come within whispering distance. Slowly, David Hunter Duncan slouched over the table, and Jim Garfield murmured the instructions. David Hunter Duncan stood upright and stared directly at Joe Fungo, He nodded to Jim Garfield and then approached his target. Joe Fungo and David Hunter Duncan proceeded to walk the perimeter of the mall together, an activity usually performed by senior citizens. What an inconspicuous pair, Jim Garfield stated sarcastically. Two men capable of working, and they have nothing better to do than to pace and chat. A washed-up biker in blue jeans and panhead t-shirt, waltzing with the vampire in his pretty new baseball cap against a backdrop where either one of them would look sorely out of place. The duo paced the mall for hours, and Jim Garfield would scurry from store to store to buy trinkets and to observe them from a distance. He had made the introductions and hoped that David Hunter Duncan's future attacks would take a lower trajectory, perhaps a course invisible to the investigators. Fungo might be reckless, but he did know how to cover his tracks. Also, Jim Garfield wanted to reestablish Fungo's trust, and he was hoping this introduction might go a long way in doing that. Let him think that he was needed. Of course, he was needed, at least for the time being. Later that evening, Jim Garfield met with David Hunter Duncan at his Regal Estates kitchen table. Only then did he learn just how well the two men had harmonized. David Hunter Duncan would reveal that not only was Fungo open to the idea of a germ attack, he had the capacity to mount one immediately. David Hunter Duncan mentioned that Joe Fungo was a gold mine of ideas, and he had the potential to become a world-class criminal. Suddenly, David Hunter Duncan fixed a cold stare on Jim Garfield and confronted him on a matter that bothered him. You have a master chemist who can manufacture crank with methods I did not know were possible, and you got him cooking smart boy drugs? Jim Garfield stared back. David Hunter Duncan did not now seem the least bit senile. He was unusually focused. Crank will get you noticed, Jim Garfield explained. We can fly under the radar with smart drugs. Do you realize how much money we could put in our pockets? The demand for smart drugs is projected, spare me the market analysis. If we sold crank, we could all retire in 2 years. Jim Garfield tried to sell the merits of safety as well as long-term growth, but David Hunter Duncan had gotten a bit surly. I can't believe you kept this information from me and Ray, his friend stated coldly and clearly. With that summary, he stood up from the table and walked out of the Regal Estates office. Deep inside himself, Jim Garfield could hear his mother's voice. That's what you get for helping people.